Hi, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. One of the trends on the show has been that I'm always interested in talking to people that have a range of creating and authoring, and that is certainly the case for my guest on this episode, David Liss. May I call you David? Is that
You
okay?
may.
All right, all right. Thank you so much for jumping in and joining. And folks out there probably know you as a writer of historical mystery from Coffee Trader to Conspiracy of Paper to the Peculiarities. I had to pause on that word, peculiarity, to make sure I get all those uh, vowels in there. But
Yeah, try promoting the book. It's really easy to it's a really easy word to mess up on. Strong advice when you're picking your titles, make sure it's comfortable to say.
True,
I've
true.
learned lesson learned at book 14 or whatever number it is.
Now you've also written in the world of comics, which is
Yes.
something intriguing to me as well that we'll talk about. So curious about what's connected you to the written word, and you can talk about that through the historical prose lens, the comic lens, or a nice blend of both.
Sure. Is that a question? Should I just talk about my
Yeah,
approach to different media?
yes,
Um,
absolutely. That would be great.
yeah, so I do write novels. I consider that my day job. I spent a lot of years writing comics, and now I also do work in the video game industry. I do video game narrative design. So my work really runs the range from, on the one hand, you have novels which are all about words and nothing but words,
Hmm.
to video games on the other end, which is where the words are there purely to enhance other kinds of engagement. So it's really about what you're writing for and what your goals are and what kind of experience you want your readers or players or whatever the case may be to experience.
Hmm.
And I tend to approach every project, um, with a set of goals in mind. Like what do I want to achieve, and what do I want the person who's going to be consuming this media to experience?
Hmm.
And that's really where how I begin thinking about any project.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. Love that audience focus. And I was not aware of your work in video games. So even another sort of avenue of creating and expressing. So very cool. And apologies for not being aware of that. I've not been a
No,
gamer
no
in a
worries.
few years. It tends to be something that kicks my OCD in, and I start to try to finish all the levels, and it gets to be time consuming. But very cool that you create in those ways and think about those approaches to storytelling. Curious about what it's like to work across media that way, particularly with writing a comic versus a prose novel steeped in history.
I mean, there's a bunch of ways in which comics and prose are very different. Um, and it took some getting used to. I was a full-time novelist for, I'm going to say, about 10 years before I wrote my first comic, and it was a fairly steep learning curve. I mean, the major difference is that comics are, of course, a visual medium.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when you're writing comics, you are coming up with what roughly those visuals will be. So that's part of the script, is to describe what will happen in a panel, what's physically happening, what the reader will eventually look at. Um, but the words on the page themselves, either in dialogue or captions or whatever, um, should be relatively few and far between. And you're really learning how to tell stories in other ways. And that was really the biggest obstacle I had, which was just trying to think about narrative and think about character and think about narrative tension, um, in ways that were not purely literary, purely verbal. Um, and of course, the other big difference for me is I'm a writer who likes to outline. I outline all of my books before I write. I outline all of my comics before I write. And then that gives me the freedom to just, I'm not sitting there with my fingers on the keyboard thinking what happens next. I know what
Hmm.
happens next, and I have the freedom to just inhabit a scene and have fun with it and take it to where where I want it to go or come up with new ideas about where I want it to go and revise my outline as I'm writing. Um, I found that when I first started writing comics, I found that much harder to do because there's something inherently stop and start about a script where you're
Hmm.
writing some description and then you're writing some dialogue. And that was something I really struggled with for a while in comics until I was at a convention and I met a writer who I'd grown up reading and loved, a guy by the name of J.M. DeMatteis, and was
Mm,
talking to him about this. And he said, try try just writing all of the scene descriptions. Like just write your panels, write the description of the panels, and don't write anything else.
mm.
And for whatever reason, that really unlocked the flow for me. And it just became much easier for me to sort of be creative in the moment rather than be creative when outlining. And so that was so my big takeaway from that was, methods that work, approaches that work in one medium will not necessarily work in another.
Yeah, yeah. Now there's a historical component to some of what you've done in comics as well, because you're using Golden Age characters, thinking about like the spider, for
Mhm.
example. So curious about what draws you to sort of writing and creating those Golden Age identities.
Um, I should preface this by saying I really like writing those characters.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why when I get to the end of this kind of build up.
Hmm.
But it really began, I mean, I guess because I'd written historical fiction, I started writing comics when Marvel approached me asking if I wanted to do they were putting together a series of one shots of characters from their early days when they were timely comics.
Hmm.
And I guess because of my work in historical fiction, they thought I might want to write one of these long forgotten characters. And so I ended up doing a comic for a character called the Phantom Reporter, who's not
Hmm.
very well remembered now. But um, essentially, what I told them was that I don't really want to learn how to write in this new medium and then never use that skill again. So if you'd
Hmm.
like me to do this, I'd like to continue working for Marvel. And they agreed. Um, and the next project I ended up doing with them also happened to be historical. It was this it was a mini series called Mystery Men, which in which the goal was to set the origins of the Marvel universe, which traditionally begins in 1939 with characters like Captain America and Namor, to set it back earlier to the early 1930s and to create uh, a team of five original characters.
Hmm.
And so by that point, I had a lot of just kind of pulpy experience under my belt. And that meant that other publishers would come to me and say, "Hey, do you want to do this other pulpy comic? Do you
Hmm.
want to write the spider? Do you want to do a shadow comic?" Um, and so some of it was really typecasting at that point, was, that I was the guy to do pulp. However, I really like doing that kind of thing. And even when I had my run on Black Panther, who's traditionally more of a just kind of larger play, kind of a larger, uh, big scale Marvel character who's involved fighting, major planet-wide or galaxy-wide threats. My run on Black Panther was with him being sort of depowered and operating on a street level. And I just found I liked writing uh, those characters better. I like writing a character who can't, who when he faces a problem, his move is not to get on the phone and call the Avengers for help. It felt like old style comics in which you have your hero against the world
Hmm.
and limited resources and having to be creative and solving problems on the fly. And I find that kind of character development much more interesting. So it was, in one on the one hand, it was the kind of work I was offered, but on the other hand, it was the kind of work I enjoyed. So it worked
Awesome.
out well.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah. Curious with that kind of viewpoint of fleshing out a story, thinking about the details, fleshing out character actions, what it's like to write a book, like the peculiarities. I nailed it again. Awesome.
You did very good.
Peculiarities. Thanks, thanks. Where you're sort of digging in, you're thinking about weaving a mystery, you're also thinking about um, the background of the story with Aleister Crowley and all of those details. This is sort of the question that gets at what research is involved, and as well as thinking about the way the plot works.
In terms of research, my philosophy has always been you do research until what you don't know is no longer getting in the way of the story you want to tell.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so the way I think about it is if I'm setting a novel in a historical setting in a particular culture, and I have an idea for something I want a character to do, and I have to stop to think, would that have been possible? Did this technology exist?
Hmm.
Did people talk this way? Did people would someone have said something about this in public in this time or in this place? Excuse me. If those are the kinds of questions I'm asking myself, then I haven't done enough research. And
Hmm.
so for me, research really is about understanding the tools that I have at my disposal, as well as understanding the worldview of the characters that inhabit that world. So I did a ton of research for that book. I've always been it's a book about the Golden Dawn and ceremonial magic at the end of the 19th century, and something
Hmm.
I've always been interested in, and I've read a lot about over the years, and had often thought about writing about. And that was a book where I really just needed a concept, that it was always in the back of my mind at one point, and I just had no idea how I would want to approach writing about that time and place and culture. And then once I had an idea for how I would write about it, then I began to think about who my characters would be,
Hmm.
what kind of conflicts they had, what kind of movement I would want them to have from the beginning of the story to the end, and then also figuring out how to weave in real characters. Like, you mentioned Aleister Crowley, and he's someone who has a pretty nasty reputation,
Hmm.
and uh, originally I conceived of him as a kind of villain in the story, but the as I was writing it, I just realized that I liked writing scenes with him in it, and that from everything I'd read, he did have a kind of real charm,
Hmm.
and that I ended up making him, instead of a bad guy, he's a real ally for my main character, but kind of one who will do some bad things for reasons that he considers good, or for reasons of gratifying his ego. So I ended up making him kind of more of a mixed character, but more of a fun one to write, certainly, and hopefully to read.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And um, curious about, you said that, was it book 14? Is that right?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Curious
like
about,
books are like birthdays. After a while, you kind of forget and have to do some math to remember where you are.
yeah, and I write academically, so people are always saying, "What's the title of that book?" And I'm like, something, something, arts-based something.
Colon something else.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Um, so curious about what has your creative attention at this moment. And I know that there might be things that you can't necessarily talk about, but curious about the work that is in progress or to come.
So I'm freelancing on a couple of games right now.
Hmm.
One of which is out, called Distant Worlds 2. It's a space strategy game, and right now, for probably the next few years, I'll be narrative designing the post-release content. And then I'm working on another as yet unannounced RPG. But in terms of novels, um, you mentioned being an academic. I have an academic background. My wife's a professor, and we talk about our work fairly regularly because it occupies our time. And my wife is currently working on editing the sort of definitive edition of Harriet Beecher Stowe's religious writings.
Awesome.
And we were in the car one day, and she was just talking about some elements of Stowe's life, her biography, and in particular one of her children. And she told me the story that was just to me just absolutely gripping. And it's kind of got an inherent mystery in it. One of her
Mm-hmm.
sons, Fred Stowe, uh, essentially disappears and is never heard from again.
Mm-hmm.
And I just immediately said that's my next book and began and working on that. So I've been researching that book and getting ready to write a book about Harry Beecher Stowe's missing son.
Awesome. Yeah. Oh, and I love the family collaboration there as
Hmm.
well. Yeah. Um, and I imagine that working in the world of comics probably was a primer for thinking about the visuals in video games as well.
Yes and no. It
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
more of a primer for learning to not um, write whatever I want without limits.
Hmm.
Um, you know, there are some real limitations in writing comics that don't exist in novels. For one thing, if I plan for a novel, I outline a novel and say, yeah, this should be about 400 pages. When it's done, if it's 450 pages or if it's 350 pages, nobody cares.
Hmm.
But in comics, they have to be a certain number of pages. You have to have, you know, within a particular range. You can't have more than a certain number of panels on a page. And learning to write within these very real limitations was useful. And also thinking about words as a secondary way of storytelling was also very useful. But writing for video games is very different from writing for comics. It was also another learning curve. And again, I just have to really think about what I want the player to experience when reading these words or hearing these words spoken by a character, and how that advances uh, the goals of the game, which
Hmm.
is, of course, for the player to enjoy himself or herself and to be engaged and to find the experience of playing meaningful for whatever, for whatever, in whatever way is appropriate for a particular type of game.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. And it makes me want to go back to the world of gaming. I'm tempted. Um,
It's a ridiculous way for an adult to make a living, but I highly endorse it.
Well, it's narrative, it's world building.
That's
So
right.
I love that aspect of it. By means of a final question, and then we can hit anything that we've missed. Spaces online where people can connect, social media wise, website wise, things like that. As you're working in the world of games, comics, prose novels, all of these things. Curious about where folks can follow along.
My website is davidliss.com, so that's easy enough. I have a very limited presence on social media, just because I really hate social media.
Hmm.
I'm on the platform formerly known as Twitter. I don't like it, but that's really the last place I am on social media, just because there are certain things about it that I find useful.
Hmm.
Um, but I may not be forever. But I'm at David underscore Liss on X, if I may call it that, and feel stupid doing so.
Anything that we've missed in the talk through that you want to make sure to share before we
Um,
close?
I would just say, I mean, one of the things I always like to emphasize about the creative process that I like to talk about is um, the extent to which um, art begins as craft.
Hmm.
And that I'm a big believer in demystifying the creative process for anyone who either wants to write or wants to have a better understanding of what they read. And there's a real there's a cultural myth about genius that if you're good at certain kinds of things, usually in the creative realm, it should be effortless. And that's just not the case. That in order to create art, you first have to understand craft, and that there are ways in which effective storytelling is done, and there are rules, and um, which is not to say that it should be formulaic, but story works for very particular kinds of ways, in very particular kinds of ways, and for particular reasons. And I think understanding those rules, understanding why narrative works the way it does, is really empowering. And I'm just a big believer in encouraging people to experiment with these things themselves and not think, oh, I've tried writing in the past and found it really hard, therefore I'm not good at it. It's really hard for me. It's really hard for most writers. There are times where a scene or a chapter or even a book can feel really energized and it can be really exhilarating, but there are far more times where it's a bit of a struggle, and that struggle is natural. And I, really encourage people not to take the difficulty of writing as a sign that they shouldn't be writing any more than if you'd never I don't know, lifted weights before and you go to the gym and you find weights kind of heavy. There's a reason for that. It's because you have to work at it. And the more you work at it, the easier it becomes.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I love that message, and um, it's not retweet anymore. Re-X, I don't know.
I think it's repost.
Repost. I would definitely repost that message. And I see that on the reading side as well. I work with students all the time who say, I'm not a reader. I'm not a reader. And you really are. There are just those areas to work on because it's all a complex process, but so worth it to share ideas. So
Absolutely.
absolutely. Yeah. So great to talk with you. Glad to talk
No,
with you again in the future.
and you, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for agreeing to come on and great to talk about the world of literature and literacy with you.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you.